Well, once again, welcome everybody. Today's conversation is focused on native trees and shrubs for pollinators. Elaine Mills is our fabulous facilitator and content expert here today. Elaine is going to be talking in just a second. In terms of her background, Elaine trained as a master gardener in 2012 and enjoys sharing her photos, her research on sustainable landscaping, and her experiences growing native plants in presentations, in articles on the MGMV website, as well as on educational posts on Facebook and Instagram. She is a wonderful resource and one of the most knowledgeable people I know. So I'm going to turn this over to Elaine to go ahead and kick us off today. Elaine?
Thank you very much, Ben. Welcome everyone to another presentation in our Sustainable Landscaping series. This particular talk is being given in recognition of Pollinator Week, which happens around the third week in June every year. We'll begin today with an introduction to our pollinators, those that you would like to welcome to your garden, and discuss the critical role of native plants for them as food sources. I'll also mention briefly the importance of native woody plants in home landscapes. And then we'll move on to take a detailed look at native understory trees and shrubs, and we'll finish up with some resources at the end of the talk. Before we look at the pollinators themselves, let's just do a quick review of pollination. This, very simply, is the transfer of pollen from the anther, or the male part of a flower, to the stigma, or the female part of a flower, enabling fertilization. Now, some plants are pollinated by the wind, but fully 3/4, 75% of our flowering plants rely on insects for reproduction. And this is a mutualistic exchange. Insects will be coming to visit the flowers for floral resources. Pollen may adhere to their bodies, and then it's carried to another flower to facilitate fertilization. Now, native insects are going to prefer native plants as a resource for these floral products. Nectar is the product they're looking for the most, and that is a source of carbohydrate energy for the various adult pollinators. It's, in a sense, their fuel for flight. Now, you may see pollinators nectaring on non-native plants, but generally they're going to prefer the nectar of native plants because that has a very specific nutrient profile. Butterflies, moths, and long-tongued bees are going to prefer sucrose-rich nectar, while short-tongued bees and flies prefer fructose and glucose in higher percentages. Insects will also be looking for pollen, and bees will actually consume this pollen. It provides nutrients to the female bees for egg production. In addition, those female bees will be gathering the pollen because it is a vital source of proteins and fats for the young bees when they're providing for them in their nests. And some bees additionally might collect resin or oil from flowers to line and waterproof their brood cells. The very first pollinators actually go back to the Mesozoic era, and they're still important pollinators of ancient species such as magnolias and spicebush. They're drawn to flowers with spicy, fruity, or fetid fragrance. They'll feed on both nectar and pollen, and they can be somewhat destructive in their feeding. As you can see, they've chewed apart some of the flowers there. They are not quite as efficient as pollinators because they tend to stay in one flower for a long time, but they can be beneficial in our gardens, additionally, as predators of aphids. Beetles tend to prefer white or cream-colored flowers, the magnolia and spicebush that I've already mentioned, as well as sweet shrub. Bees are really our best pollinators, first because they are purposefully collecting pollen. They have fuzzy bodies and special parts to actually hold the pollen. They will use the nectar and pollen combined with saliva to form what are referred to as pollen loaves. These will provide energy for the young bees when they're provisioning their nests. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there are nearly 500 species of bees in the mid-Atlantic. And just a reminder that honeybees are not native bees. Some of the bees are social. Bumblebees are the best example of that, but most of our native bees are solitary. That means that without a colony to defend, these bees are going to rely much less on stinging. 70% of native bees nest underground and 30% in cavities or the stems of native plants. There are 7 families of bees worldwide. 6 of them are represented in the United States. And on the left, you can see a list of the types of bees that are most likely to visit in your garden with the names of the genera, the scientific names. Bees vary greatly in size, from the larger bees like carpenter and bumblebees all the way down to tiny sweat bees. And they also vary in tongue length, and that will determine which specific native flowers they will be visiting. But there are certain characteristics that they have in common. They all have long antennae, large eyes on the sides of their heads, fuzzy bodies, defined waist, generally a compact shape, and 2 pairs of wings. And as I've mentioned, they have special structures for collecting pollen. Bumblebees have what are referred to as corbiculae. Corbicula is the singular form of the word. These are flat, shiny parts of the tibia of their hind legs. And as you can see here, they are filling them up with pollen. Then other bees have what are referred to as scopae. These are dense patches of barbed hairs that can also be used to collect pollen, and these tend to be on the underside of the abdomen. When you're looking at herbaceous plants, you usually hear that bees are attracted to blue or purple flowers, and secondarily to yellow or white flowers. Most of the flowers of our woody plants are going to be white. Some of the favorites of bees are eastern redbud, black chokeberry, and buttonbush. Most female bees collect pollen from many genera of native plants, and they're referred to as polylectic bees. But 30% of our native bees have evolved over time as what are referred to as pollen specialists or oligolectic bees, and they're going to collect from fewer native species. One example on the right is the mining bee that is going to purposefully use the pollen only of the native black willow for provisioning her nests. These bees will use olfactory cues to help them find their host plants, and that type of foraging can be efficient. One concern these days with climate change is there can be a mismatch in the emergence of the bees that may rely on warmer air temperatures and the emergence of their needed flowers, which may in some cases refer to day length to emerge. Bees use other parts of plants in addition to flowers. Some bees, such as carpenter bees, create nests in pithy plant stems. Some examples would be our native bush honeysuckle, elderberry, and the various sumac species. And leafcutter bees use leaf pieces to construct their nests. They'll cut away semicircular edges from the leaves, then carry them away, and they'll roll them tightly. They'll insert an egg and the little pollen loaf inside and wrap it in kind of a cigar shape. Flies are the second most efficient pollinators, and syrphid, sometimes referred to as flower or hoverflies, such as the one you see pictured in the lower right, resemble bees. They have the same kind of large eyes, but they differ in that they have only one set of wings, short antennae, and no defined waist. The adults will feed on nectar and or pollen, and they can be active at fairly low temperatures. Their young are helpful in the garden in controlling aphids and scales. Flies prefer dark brown, purple, or pale flowers, and examples of those would be cockspur hawthorn, pawpaw, and gray dogwood. Wasps are the evolutionary ancestors of bees, but they're less efficient because they're hairless. They have many characteristics in common, of course: long antennae and eyes on the sides of their heads, 2 pairs of wings, but their waists are much more finely defined, and they have an elongated shape. Adult wasps will visit flowers for nectar and pollen for energy, but they are predatory or parasitoid in that they will feed their young other insects or spiders. The predatory wasps will bring caterpillars, grasshoppers, and the spiders to their young to feed on in the nests. And the parasitoid wasps will actually lay their eggs on other insects. They will be consumed by the young. Now, most insect stings are actually caused by social wasps, not bees. And solitary wasps are not aggressive and are really beneficial in our gardens because they will help control pest insects. Wasps tend to prefer white or yellow flowers with shallow corollas. And examples of those would be the sumac species, New Jersey tea, and sweet pepper bush. Butterflies are among some of our favorite pollinators. The numbers vary among the different mid-Atlantic states, with a low of just over 100 species in Virginia to up to 150 in Maryland. And you may recall that there are different categories of butterflies: the skippers that have little hooks on their knobbed antennae, and the fritillaries that are known for the black and orange check patterns on their wings. Butterflies will seek nectar with long tube-like mouth parts. These are referred to as the proboscis. And although they are poster children as pollinators, they are really the primary pollinators for only about 8% of plants. This is because they have relatively little contact with the flowers standing up on their long legs. But some pollen may remain on their wings, head, or the proboscis. Butterflies prefer flat or composite flowers, such as common ninebark, great rhododendron, and common elderberry. One really important thing to be aware of is that butterflies require native host plants for their full life cycle. The adults can use the nectar of various plants as flight fuel, but they have special evolved relationships with native plant species to support their young. In other words, the adults, for example, could nectar on a non-native plant like butterfly bush, but that plant will not serve as a so-called larval host plant, and it can't support the full life cycle of butterflies. Butterflies will go through various stages of metamorphosis, with the adult females laying eggs on the undersides of leaves, and then they will go through the caterpillar and pupa stages before emerging as full-fledged butterflies. Now, the example I'm showing here is for the monarch butterfly, which feeds on an herbaceous plant, the milkweeds, but the process is the same for the woody plants. There can be from 1 to multiple generations of butterflies per season, depending on the species, and the feeding is in ecological balance. So particularly for the larger plants like trees or shrubs, you'll see relatively little evidence of this feeding that's going on. The caterpillars are not going to destroy the plants. Some examples of native larval host plants for our butterfly caterpillars are tulip poplar for the eastern tiger swallowtail, black cherry for the red spotted purple, and flowering dogwood for the summer azure. Moths are much more abundant than butterfly species. They can vary greatly in size for less than an inch to up to 3 to 4 inches across. They also will have a long proboscis to enable them to access nectar or tree sap. But many adult moths do not feed. They actually lack that proboscis, the mouth parts, and they don't have active digestive systems. That means that they're going to rely on that all-important caterpillar stage to do their feeding. They will live only a short period of time, maybe a few days, a week at the most, in order to mate, but then they will die. Pollen may collect on the bodies of moths as they're visiting flowers. And they tend to prefer pale or white tubular flowers. Examples are high-bush blueberry, snowberry, and the native bush honeysuckle. Moths also need larval host plants as they go through their various stages of development. They can make use of trees, native shrubs, as well as a third category of woody plants, the vines. Let's speak briefly about the importance of native woody plants in our landscapes. First of all, they will provide a greatly varied palette of plants beyond just the herbaceous plants that you might already have for nectar and pollen. They are visited by a wide variety of insects, including those specialist bees that I mentioned. And of course, our woody plants are long-lived and they're going to bloom for many consecutive seasons. It's been found in studies that woody plants support that caterpillar stage of many more species of butterflies and moths, our Lepidoptera, than the herbaceous plants do. And those abundant caterpillars, in turn, will be very critical to support our dwindling bird populations. It takes from 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed a nest of young birds for each season. Our woody plants can additionally provide fruit for other wildlife and for us. And by introducing woody plants, you're adding layers to your garden to make it more attractive and to create a more functional landscape. You're going to provide shelter and nesting sites, especially for the birds that are going to feed and nest in plants at different levels. And these plants can also provide screening for you, as well as cooling and energy savings. The foliage of these larger plants will buffer the impact of rain, and their root systems will help absorb stormwater, allowing you to keep this water on your property. And these larger plants also provide other critical ecosystem services. They provide oxygen for us to breathe. They help filter pollutants from the air, and they help sequester carbon. Doug Tallamy, a well-known entomologist, has committed himself to detailed studies of both herbaceous and woody plants, and he's determined that the tree species that you see pictured at the bottom of the screen are those that are going to provide the highest levels of support to the caterpillar stage of our local butterflies and moths. These range from the oaks that support 534 different species, all the way down to hawthorn that supports 159 species. Now, these are mostly what are referred to as canopy level trees, those that are ranging from, say, about 50 to 75 feet or more. And because I've described these plants in detail in a previous presentation, Keystone Species of Native Plants, if you've been lucky enough to inherit one of these plants on your property, or if you have a larger property and would like to add one of these trees, you can refer to this presentation to learn about all the benefits that those trees will provide. If you want to add the other category of woody plants to your garden, the vines, I refer you to this earlier talk. It will explain how they can also provide nectar and pollen and serve as larval host plants. Right now, we're going to be taking a closer look at native understory trees. These are trees that are going to range from, say, about 15 feet in height to maybe 30 feet at the most. And you can follow along on your handout. I'm going to be describing them pretty much in bloom time order. The first of these is downy serviceberry, Amelanchier arborea. It ranges in height from 15 to 25 feet. It's a multi-stemmed plant and one that you might like to add near patios, in groups, or as shown here in a woodland garden. I would avoid planting it if you have cedar trees nearby, because these two categories of plants are alternate hosts for cedar apple rust. This plant can grow in sun to part shade. The greater the exposure to sun, the more fruitful it will be. Downy serviceberry has fragrant flowers in March to April, and this is an important early source of nectar for our native bees. It has downy oval leaves, and these serve as a larval host for the red-spotted purple, the viceroy, and moths. And the fruit, referred to as pomes because they have a dense central core, kind of like an apple or a pear, they will appear in May. They are greatly enjoyed by songbirds, and we can enjoy them as well. They have a taste something like highbush blueberry, a little bit sweeter. The plants are also enjoyable through the seasons for their brilliant fall color and dappled bark. Now, as you'll notice, I'm moving along at a fairly good clip, and I'm not mentioning every single one of the points that you'll see in these text boxes. But if you follow the links on the handout, you will see all of this information in addition to many details on care if you follow the links to fact sheets. Additionally, because I'm providing so much information on the native ranges of the plants, as you see here, and the specific species of pollinators that are supported, I'm going to be providing a PDF of all of these slides. So you won't need to worry about taking detailed notes. All of this information will be available to you in various formats. So moving along, the next tree to bloom is the pawpaw, Asimina triloba. This is a short trunk tree with a rounded crown, a little bit taller, 15 to 30 feet, growing in sun to part shade. You could use this as a fruit tree, or because it likes moist to wet soil, in a rain or native plant garden. It's important to know that although this plant suckers, in other words, it's going to send out shoots, and you could see additional trees growing, those are going to all be clones. And you would want to introduce separate plants of different genetic strains to allow cross-pollination to occur and to produce the fruit. Pawpaw has these purplish brown flowers in April with a somewhat unpleasant scent, although that's very appealing to flies and beetles who come for nectar and pollen. Pawpaw has large tropical-like leaves. These are very attractive to our zebra swallowtail butterflies and the pawpaw sphinx moth. Pawpaw has an attractive yellow fall color. Late in summer, fruit will develop, and this is enjoyed both by birds and box turtles. Now, for many years, we've been hearing about people enjoying the pawpaw. It's a custard-like fruit with a sweet taste, something like bananas. Recently, I've seen an exchange of email messages between members of the local Virginia Native Plant Society chapter, and concerns were raised about a particular neurotoxin, annonacin, that is present in this plant. So you may want to do a little more reading about that before you decide whether you want to consume this fruit or not. Eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis, is another tree with a short trunk, an umbrella-like crown. It ranges from 15 to 30 feet in height. This particular tree tends to be somewhat short-lived, and I think this has something to do with the fact that it doesn't have a really well-defined central leader, and it may get somewhat misshapen in its growth. It can survive very well in a range of sun exposures, as you see, from full sun to full shade. It's very attractive as a specimen, patio or lawn tree, an understory tree in a forested area. Note that it is very sensitive to herbicides and chemicals that are sprayed on lawns. Eastern redbud has pea-like blossoms from April to May, and they exhibit a very unusual growth pattern referred to as cauliflory. That means that the buds can actually emerge directly from branches or the trunks of the tree. These particular blossoms are going to be very attractive as an early nectar and pollen source for butterflies and a specialist bee. Eastern redbud has heart-shaped leaves with smooth edges, and these provide nourishment for 12 species of Lepidoptera, including Henry's elfin and the Io moth. And they are also favored by leafcutter bees for their nest building. Seed pods will develop in May and last through December, eaten by birds, and they can also emerge directly from the trunk of the tree. Sassafras albidum, has an irregular trunk and a flat-topped crown, and it is probably the tallest of the understory species I'm describing. It grows in sun to part shade. You can grow it either as a single trunk tree, a specimen tree, or you can allow it to colonize for screening. Sassafras has fragrant April flowers on separate male and female plants. In other words, the species is said to be dioecious. This plant provides nectar as an early source for both bees and butterflies. It's recognized as unusual because of 3 different leaf shapes: oval, mitten-shaped, and 3-lobed. And these serve as a larval host for swallowtails and several different species of moths. We sometimes use the leaves as filet powder for culinary purposes. This tree is known for its brilliant fall foliage, and the egg-shaped fruit that forms on female trees is eaten by many species of birds. Flowering dogwood, our state tree of Virginia, Cornus florida, is another flat-top tree noted for its horizontal branching, and it will range in height from 15 to 30 feet. It's very attractive, used as a specimen near patios or grouped on a woodland edge. Now, some people are concerned about introducing dogwoods to their landscape because they've heard about the disease anthracnose, the systemic anthracnose that can be fatal to these trees actually occurs more at higher elevations. For those of us living in the Piedmont and coastal plain regions, the disease would be the less destructive spot anthracnose. And you can even avoid that with proper siting. In other words, treat this truly as an understory tree. It does best in part shade rather than full sun. Additionally, provide moist, organically rich, acidic soil. It benefits from mulching around the roots of the tree and supplemental water during periods of drought in the summertime. Flowering dogwood has showy petal-like bracts, either creamy white or sometimes pink, that we'll see in mid to late April. The true flowers in the center are much less conspicuous for us, but they are very attractive for nectar and pollen. They attract specialist bees and flies. And the leaves of flowering dogwood have these characteristic curving veins of the Cornus genus. We enjoy the bright fall foliage, and this tree provides fruit for birds and mammals. Pagoda dogwood, another of our lovely native species, is Cornus alternifolia. It also has horizontal branching in tiers. It's a little shorter, 15 to 25 feet high, and prefers part to full shade. You can plant it singly, as I have done here in my garden. It's also attractive grouped around patios or in woodland gardens. It has alternate leaves, as is revealed by the species name, alternifolia. It differs in that way from other members of the Cornus genus, and these will seem whorled at the tips of the branches. It has a very attractive maroon fall color, and this plant serves as the larval host for the Cecropia silk moth and the spring azure butterfly. Flat, fragrant flowers will bloom a little bit later in the season. They've just finished in my garden here in Northern Virginia, and they will provide nectar and pollen to bees, including a specialist bee, as well as flies, wasps, and butterflies. It's just beginning to show its fruit now here in early June, and that is enjoyed by 43 different bird species. And when the individual fruits are gone, there'll be attractive lingering red fruit stalks. Fringe tree, Chionanthus virginicus, is another multi-stem tree. It's 20 to 35 feet in height and can grow in quite a range of sun exposures. You can use it as a specimen in groups or in woodland gardens, or here you can see it as it's used as a street tree in my neighborhood. Now, there have been some questions about the susceptibility of this tree to the pest emerald ash borer. That particular pest appeared in 2014 in Ohio, then spread to Illinois. And in speaking with a local tree steward, she's told me that our urban forester has alerted us that this tree could eventually become susceptible to the emerald ash borer, although none of us has noted any trees succumbing to this at this point. Fringe tree will have leaves showing up in late April, providing nourishment for the caterpillar stage of sphinx moths. And then fragrant flowers appear in May. The male flowers are said to be showier. When I looked at many different trees, I was having trouble telling them apart, but they do provide nectar to diverse pollinators. And olive-like fruit will be borne on female trees in July to August. The last of our understory trees is Sweet Bay Magnolia, Magnolia virginiana, sometimes known as swamp magnolia, a coastal plain plant. This is a multi-stemmed tree with a rounded crown, 20 to 30 feet in height, and it can be evergreen in certain regions depending on how harsh the winters are. You can use it as a specimen or patio plant, or because it grows in moist to wet soil and even tolerates occasional flooding, you could use it in a large rain garden over 150 square feet in size. Sweet Bay Magnolia has shiny green foliage and serves as the larval host for swallowtail butterflies, the Promethea, and Sweet Bay silk moth. It has large lemon-scented flowers from May to June, and these provide nectar to beetles and moths. Cone-like fruits will mature in late summer and open up to reveal bright seeds as nourishment for birds and mammals. And in the winter, you'll enjoy the smooth, lightly scented bark. Do we have any questions about our local trees, Ben?
Someone in the chat would love to know if you have an opinion on how far from cedar trees should service be.
Yes, our local extension agent has warned that the spores can even be carried over a distance of up to a mile. This could be problematic because there are so many of those cedar trees, either the taller eastern red cedars or even some of the cedar plants that we grow as sunny ground covers. The main problem is that there will be an unsightly growth, an orange growth that forms on the fruit of the serviceberry. This, of course, is not appealing from a cosmetic point of view, but it's not going to destroy the tree. It's not going to kill it. But if you can possibly plant them as far apart as possible, try to do that.
Todd also had a question about where specifically you found the information about the number of species of Lepidoptera. Is there a single source for the butterfly data, or did you use multiple sources?
I used multiple sources, and I've been conducting this research over a period of several months to compile it all here in one place. Among the different sources are the Xerxes Society, the works of Heather Holm, who is quite renowned for her knowledge of bees and wasps, and the North Carolina State Extension Plant Toolbox has very helpful information, sometimes even telling you about how many generations of butterflies will be served by these plants. So those are among the sources that I pulled together for this presentation.
Great. And Trish has a follow-up question about serviceberry. She's wondering if the cultivars of serviceberry are as valuable as the straight species.
I'm not personally aware of cultivars of that particular plant, but as long as the flowers and the foliage are the same, they will provide the same benefits. I'll be talking a little bit more about problems with change in foliage when we get to some of the shrubs. We'll move on now to talk about native shrubs. There are many more of them than there are the native trees. And again, you can follow along on the handout, and I'll be discussing them in bloom order. The first to bloom is spice bush, Lindera benzoin. This has a broad rounded habit, 6 to 16 feet in height. It can tolerate a range of sun exposures, but really does best in part shade. This plant is referred to as the forsythia of the wilds and is especially suited to our woodland gardens. Spice bush has small fragrant flowers. It's a dioecious plant, so you'll see these on separate male and female plants, and they'll appear as early as March on into April, providing early nectar and pollen sources for our bees, flies, and butterflies. It has oval leaves and serves as a larval host for both the eastern tiger and spice bush swallowtail butterflies, and has a lovely clear yellow fall color. You'll see a nutritious fall fruit on the female plants, very helpful for providing nourishment for our migrating birds. Additionally, some foragers enjoy using the dried fruit, grating it and using it in cooking. It can be a substitute for allspice. Black chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa, is an upright multi-stemmed shrub, somewhat shorter at 4 to 6 feet in height. It's a great native alternative for the overused non-native euonymus. It can be used as a hedge, or as I show here in my garden, as a foundation plant. And you can take advantage of the suckering, the spread of the plant, to help you make a denser hedge. We've sometimes introduced low-scape mound into our gardens at only 2 feet high and wide. It's very attractive as an edging plant at the front of beds. It will have the same flowers, the same leaves, and the same fruit as the full-sized species. Black chokeberry has white flowers with these very interesting pink anthers, and you'll see them from April to May. They provide nectar and pollen, especially for our mason and mining bees. This plant has glossy, lightly serrated leaves, very characteristic of the rose family plants, and it's an excellent larval host plant supporting 29 species, including the coral hairstreak and the bluish spring moth. It has a wine red fall color. I personally find the foliage of the red chokeberry, Aronia arbutifolia, to have an even more brilliant fall color. Both of those species of native shrubs have very nutritious fruit. The black chokeberry fruit will appear in July and be eaten pretty readily by birds. It also can be enjoyed by us. It's very high in anthocyanins, and you wouldn't want to eat it raw because it's so astringent, but it can be used cooked in jams and preserves. Pinkster bloom azalea, Rhododendron periclymenoides, is a multi-stemmed plant with horizontal branching. It's somewhat shorter at 3 to 6 feet in height, and it's definitely going to prefer our understory conditions of part shade with dappled sunlight. Note that this is going to grow in very acidic soil with a pH ranging from 4.5 to 5.5. A great native alternative to the Asian azaleas. You could use it in foundation plantings, in butterfly gardens, or as it appears here in a woodland garden. The Pinkster bloom azalea buds will appear either before or along with the emerging leaves. Those are ovate to elliptic in shape, and they appear whorled at the branch tips. Pinkster bloom azalea differs from the Asian azaleas in that it has fragrant flowers. Those grow in large clusters from April to May with these protruding stamens, and they will provide nectar and pollen not only for bees and butterflies, but for hummingbirds as well. Black haw, Viburnum prunifolium, is the tallest of our native viburnums, ranging from 12 to 15 feet in height. It grows in sun to part shade and could be a great replacement for invasive Japanese privet. You could use it as a tall specimen plant by pruning it to just a single trunk, or you could allow it to sucker and use it in shrub borders or as a hedge or a screen. I'm using it as a screening plant here between my property and that of a neighbor. Black haw has large clusters of non-fragrant white flowers, very small, but the clusters are about 4 inches across, and they will be in bloom from April to May, attracting myriad small bees, flies, and various Lepidoptera for both nectar and pollen. Black haw has oval leaves and serves as a larval host for moths, including the hummingbird clearwing, and has a lovely red burgundy fall color. You'll see these drupes, fruits that have a pit inside, something like an olive, from July to November. They're enjoyed by birds, and these can also be consumed by us, again, not raw, but used in cooking. Another of our native viburnums is arrowwood, Viburnum dentatum. This is another multi-stem shrub with a rounded shape, ranging from 6 to 10 feet in height. A lovely native alternative to the Asian bush honeysuckle. You can use this, as I do, as a screen. I have a group of 3 of them along a fence at the front of my garden to give me some privacy. But then on the other side, I use the shrubs as a background for native plantings of shorter herbaceous plants. This grows in sun to part shade. Arrowwood has similar flowers to the black haw, non-fragrant flowers. These will bloom a little bit later in May, providing nectar and pollen for bees and butterflies. Arrowwood has ovate, distinctly toothed leaves, and they take on a fabulous orange-red fall color. They are the larval host for the spring azure butterfly. Nutritious summer fruit will be enjoyed by birds, and you will get the best fruiting with multiples. Arrowwood is not a dioecious plant. You don't have separate male and female plants. But if you have several species of different genetic strains, you'll get the best cross-pollination and provide more abundant fruit. Strawberry bush, Euonymus americanus, is a very airy multi-stemmed plant, about 4 to 6 feet in height, perfect as a native alternative to invasive Nandina. You could use it along foundations as a hedge or grouped in woodland margins, as you see here. This is a plant that's going to prefer part shade and can actually tolerate full shade. Strawberry bush has very delicate yellow-green flowers. They're only about a ½ inch across. They are in bloom in May, and they provide nectar and pollen for a wide range of insects, including bees, beetles, flies, and ants. It has oval leaves on distinctly green twigs, and those leaves will take on a dark red fall color. But the truly outstanding feature of strawberry bush are these unique fruits. They have a rather warty raspberry-colored outer covering, and then they open to reveal these almost day-glow orange-red bright arils. They are the fleshy covering to the seeds, and they are eaten to some extent by birds. Common ninebark, Physocarpus apulifolius, is a fountaining multi-stemmed shrub, a perfect native alternative to Forsythia. It's known for its exfoliating bark. It's said to peel away in 9 different layers, leading to the common name. Because it can range as high as 10 feet wide and 10 feet tall, I personally use this as an anchor plant at the back of one of my large pollinator beds that's filled for the most part with herbaceous plants. And it also can serve as a screen. You can just barely see the house next door. Common ninebark has very showy domed flowers that are going to bloom in May. They'll provide nectar and pollen to bees, butterflies, and beetles. It has these interesting lobed leaves, a beautiful medium green, and they will provide nourishment for several moth species. The foliage is also enjoyed by leafcutter bees to form their little cigar-like nests. Now, common ninebark, maybe more than any other native shrub, has undergone a lot of cultivation, and there are many very popular cultivars. They range from foliage color to a golden color, orange, purple, wine red. They're very attractive to us. They add greatly to the aesthetics of the garden, but just an alert that with the foliage color change, there is a change in the leaf chemistry, and the leaves will no longer be able to serve as host plants for our Lepidoptera. A common ninebark has these very interesting red-brown seed capsules, and they'll remain as interest through the winter. Inkberry, Ilex glabra, is a lovely evergreen shrub. So answering that question about evergreens, not a lot of our native shrubs are evergreen, but this is one of them. And one alert is that you'll want to protect it from harsh winter weather. Any evergreen plant will tend to collect heavy ice and snow on its foliage. So you'll want to be sure either to have a protective covering or to go out and knock that heavy covering off of that. This plant can grow from 6 to 10 feet in height in sun to part shade. It's a great alternative to boxwood, which is suffering quite a bit in our region with blight. This is a great plant to use in borders. You can take advantage of the suckering of the straight species to allow it to grow as a hedge. And because it prefers moist to wet soil, it's a great selection for erosion control. Inkberry's flowers appear from May to June. Here's a look at the male flowers with their anthers, and the female flowers will have just a dark green central cone. These provide nectar and pollen to bees, especially the Colletes specialist bee, as well as butterflies. The plant has glossy, leathery leaves. These will serve as a larval host for the Henry's elfin, and of course can provide year-round cover. Fruit will appear from September to March, supporting 15 bird species. Virginia sweetspire, Itea virginica, has an arching to rounded habit, ranges from 6 to 10 feet in height, and grows in sun to part shade. You'll see shortly how this could be a fabulous replacement for invasive burning bush. This plant, more than any other in my garden, will send out numerous suckers, these additional shoots. And this makes it perfect for use as a hedge or a foundation planting. And because it prefers moist to wet soil and even tolerates flooding, it can be used very efficiently in a rain garden or for erosion control. There are a number of shorter cultivars available. Among them, the most popular are Henry's Garnet, 5 feet high and wide, and Little Henry, about 3 feet high and wide. There are many others, and the flowers and the foliage of these are the same as the straight species. It's only the height that has been modified. Virginia sweetspire has drooping cylindrical flower clusters from May to June. They provide nectar and pollen to bees, wasps, and butterflies. The lustrous oval leaves take on a flaming fall color. You'll see fruit capsules developing as early as June, and those will linger on the shrub through till March and provide seeds that can be eaten by birds. Mountain laurel, Kalmia latifolia, is one of the showiest of our native shrubs. It's multi-stemmed and another evergreen selection. It grows 5 to 20 feet in height, so it's one of the larger shrubs. A very important point is that it is going to prefer acidic soil in the 4.5 to 6.5 range. It could be a very nice native alternative to Asian camellias. And because it likes part shade, doing best in morning sun or dappled shade, I would recommend its use in shaded shrub borders. And because of its preference for acidic soil, it's an excellent complement to other native rhododendron species, rhododendrons and azaleas. Mountain laurel has clusters of cup-shaped flowers in May. They're either white, as you see here, or sometimes pink. And they have a very unusual way of dispersing their pollen. The anthers are spring-loaded, and they're attached at the points of the flower that are raspberry colored. These are under tension, and when bees or other insects land on the corolla of the flower, they will release, and then they'll fling the pollen at quite a high speed onto the backs of the insects. This plant has shiny evergreen leaves and over time develops a short and somewhat crooked trunk. And you'll also see fruit resulting from those pollinated flowers as fruit for the birds. Elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, has a rather loose and arching form and ranges in height from 9 to 12 feet. It grows in sun to part shade, moist soil, but it tolerates a wide range of soil types, a great native alternative to the European elderberry. You could use this as a specimen plant, or since it spreads via suckers, you could allow it to sucker in naturalized areas. You'll see fragrant flowers in May in wide, flat clusters, and these provide nectar and pollen for bees, syrphid, or the flower or hoverflies, as well as butterflies. It has compound leaves that provide nourishment for both butterflies and moths, including the Cecropia moth. Interestingly, it has both woody and herbaceous branches, and the woody or pithy lower parts of the stalks can be used by our stem nesting bees. Fruit will develop in July. It's enjoyed by many birds, and it can also be consumed by us, again, not when raw, but when cooked. And the flowers are sometimes used in making tea. Possum haw, Viburnum nudum, is the third of the 3 viburnum species I'm introducing today. It is another one of the multi-stemmed shrubs with a somewhat rounded habit, 5 to 12 feet in height, growing in sun to part shade. It could be a great native alternative to invasive non-native viburnums. These would be the T. viburnum, the linden, the double file, or the Seabold viburnums. This is a great plant to use in borders or at woodland edges because it likes the part shade conditions. And because it likes moist to wet soil, a great choice for rain gardens or use at the edges of streams or ponds. Like the other viburnums, it has flat clusters of white flowers. These are just finishing their bloom in my garden now in June. These provide nectar and pollen to bees and butterflies. And this viburnum has the glossiest leathery leaves of all of those I've mentioned. And these take on a beautiful maroon purple color in the fall. They serve as a larval host to the spring azure. Another interesting feature is this nutritious fruit. It forms in July to October, enjoyed by birds. And in those fruit clusters, you'll see pink, blue, and purple fruit all appearing at the same time. New Jersey tea, Ceanothus americanus, is probably the shortest of the shrubs I'm describing today, upright and multi-stemmed in habit. It can grow in sun to part shade, a great native alternative to Japanese spirea. This is ideal for use as a ground cover plant on dry slopes because it has a massive root system, making it very drought tolerant and great for erosion control. One note is that you'll want to site it carefully because it doesn't transplant well. Another interesting feature is that this is a nitrogen fixing plant. That means that it has bacteria associated with its roots that allow it to draw down nitrogen directly from the air. New Jersey tea has fragrant flowers. They're in bloom now in my garden in June. These provide nectar and pollen to bees, including Adrena specialists, wasps, butterflies, flies, and beetles. It has toothed ovate leaves and serves as a larval host for the spring and summer azure, the mottled dusky wing, and some moths. And interestingly, this is the plant whose leaves were used as a tea by the colonists when they were boycotting British tea. New Jersey tea has interesting three-lobed fruits. The seeds are eaten by songbirds, and these, along with the somewhat yellow color of the bare branches in the winter, will add special interest in your garden at that time. Wild hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens, is a mound-shaped plant with unbranched canes, 3 to 6 feet in height. It will definitely prefer part to full shade and moist soil because it's intolerant of drought. A lovely native alternative to the Asian mophead hydrangea. Unlike the Asian species, the flowers of our native wild hydrangea are not affected by the pH of the soil. This is very attractive when massed in a shady shrub border or grouped in a woodland garden. The flowers of wild hydrangea are in prime bloom right now in June, and eventually seeds will be formed that will be enjoyed by birds. The nectar and pollen are enjoyed by bees, wasps, and syrphid flies. Wild hydrangea has large quilted leaves and serves as a larval host for the hydrangea sphinx and leaf tear moths, and has an attractive fall color. An alert: there are many cultivars of this plant, and those that are very showy, like the Annabelle pictured here, are not going to have the reproductive parts that you see so prominently on the straight species. They are going to consist primarily of these very attractive but sterile flowers. So that means that they will not provide any pollinator support. You can read about the various cultivars, some of which are more recommended than others, in a recent report of plant trials conducted by Mount Cuba up in Delaware. Buttonbush, Cephalanthus occidentalis, has a rounded, somewhat irregular form and ranges from 6 to 12 feet in height. This is another shrub that can grow in a wide range of sun exposures. A great native alternative to the butterfly bush, which I mentioned earlier, that will only provide nectar, but not the full support for our butterflies. This is a great plant to use in shrub borders, and because it likes moist to wet soil and can even tolerate flooding up to 36 inches, it makes it an ideal selection for rain gardens or use beside ponds. Buttonbush has fragrant tubular flowers, very interesting, extending female parts of the flower, the styles that go beyond the central part of the flower. These bloom from June to July and attract a wide range of insects as well as hummingbirds. It has glossy oval leaves and serves as a larval host for a range of moths. Its fall color is not particularly notable, but these seed heads, which consist of nutlets, are very interesting. They'll persist on in the winter for an attractive feature in our gardens, and they'll also provide nourishment for songbirds and waterfowl. Great rhododendron, Rhododendron maximum, also known as rosebay rhododendron, is another of our native evergreen shrubs, multi-stemmed, ranging from 5 to 15 feet in height. It's another one that distinctly prefers part to full shade. It is also growing best in soil with a pH of 4.5 to 6.0, a great native alternative to the hybrid rhododendrons, and nice to use in shady shrub borders or on woodland margins. Note that this plant is intolerant of what we refer to as wet feet. It's going to like moist to drier soil. And it's also toxic to dogs, cats, and humans. Now, for those of you who have concerns about toxicity of plants in general, I refer you to the North Carolina State Extension Plant Toolbox. They make a special point of highlighting any plants that have a range of toxicity, either to us or to various animals. Great rhododendron has clusters of very large flowers. The individual flowers are even an inch or so across, and you'll see those a little bit later in the season from June to July. They offer nectar and pollen to bees, including a specialist, as well as butterflies and hummingbirds. Great rhododendron is a larval host for the tiger swallowtail and elegant sphinx moth. It has leathery strap-like leaves that are going to provide excellent winter and all-weather cover for our wildlife. These seeds are enjoyed by songbirds. Winterberry, Ilex verticillata, unlike the Ilex glabra I mentioned earlier, is a deciduous holly. This has a rounded form and ranges in height from 6 to 12 feet. It grows in sun to part shade, prefers moist to wet soil, and another one that tends to prefer a more acidic pH. A great native alternative to the invasive autumn olive shrub. You can use it as a hedge, and because it likes that moist to wet soil, it could also do well in a rain garden or planted to control erosion. There are a number of dwarf cultivars available, among them Berry Poppins and Mr. Poppins that we use in one of our Master Gardener demonstration gardens. Winterberry's flowers are just beginning to show and develop now in the June to July period. This is another dioecious plant. Here, the female flowers are shown, and then the male flowers will have very prominent anthers. Now, with these dioecious plants, you can have just one male plant and it can service multiple female plants. You can plant them immediately side by side, or as long as they're planted in your garden within about 40 feet, the pollen can be carried from the male flowers to the female plant. The nectar and pollen will be used by bees, including a specialist bee, as well as wasps. These lovely quilted leaves will provide seasonal cover and can serve as a larval host for the Henry's elfin. A very attractive feature of winterberry is its fruit. It will begin developing, it'll be green in color in the summer and will begin to ripen over the winter, providing great food for up to 48 bird species and fueling their migratory flight. It tends to do best for the birds when it goes through a freeze and thaw cycle. So you sometimes may see the fruit lingering on into the winter, even after the leaves have dropped. American beautyberry, Calicarpa americana, is a vase-shaped plant with arching branches, a great native alternative to the Japanese beautyberry. It ranges from 3 to 6 feet in height and does best in sun to part shade. In fact, it's intolerant of deep shade. You can use it in a large container, in borders, or in open woods, as pictured here. American beautyberry has lovely lavender to pink flowers in July, and those of the native species are going to completely encircle the stem. They'll provide nectar to butterflies and especially to bees. American beautyberry, unlike the Asian species, has very large toothed leaves. It will serve as a larval host to the spring azure butterfly and the snowberry clearwing moth. This particular plant is being studied for its chemical properties. Calicarpanol, one of those chemicals, is being considered for use as a natural insect repellent. And of course, an outstanding feature is this fruit that develops in September, enjoyed by over 40 species of songbirds. Sweet pepper bush, Clethra alnifolia, has an upright, rounded habit, ranges from 3 to 8 feet in height. It can tolerate a range of sun exposures, but will do best in part shade. And it could be a great native alternative to the overused non-native cherry laurel. I recommend its use in butterfly gardens, and because it prefers moist to wet soil, it's an excellent selection for rain gardens or to control erosion on the banks of ponds or streams. There are some dwarf cultivars. One example is hummingbird, that's about 3 feet high and wide. Sweet pepper bush has lovely fragrant flowers. It's attractive because it will be providing bloom in your garden as late as August. It has pink cultivars. One popular one is ruby spice. It will provide nectar and pollen to many native bees, butterflies, and will also attract hummingbirds. It has quilted leaves that serve as a larval host for 11 moth species and has a brilliant fall color. You'll see these spikes of dry capsules, and they will persist for up to a year, a very attractive ornamental feature that's also enjoyed by birds. The last of our understory shrubs to bloom in the garden is witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, a multi-stemmed shrub, 15 to 20 feet in height with a vase shape. This could be a great native alternative if you're removing invasive buckthorn. It's attractive as a specimen or a patio tree, and because it can form colonies, you could allow it to spread in a woodland area. Witch hazel has these very distinctive yellow ribbon-like flowers. They'll begin blooming in the fall and continue on into December. And there's been an ongoing study about which pollinators are actually doing the pollinating. There's some conjecture that it might be the winter flying owlet moths. These particular insects can thermoregulate. In other words, their bodies can function even in freezing temperatures. I mentioned earlier that flies can tolerate lower temperatures, and some smaller bees have even been observed on the witch hazels. It has lovely oval scalloped leaves and serves as a larval host to the spring azure and some moths. And you'll see this lovely orange fall color. Green fruit capsules will eject seeds in the next season. And very quickly, I'd just like to highlight a few species that aren't as prominent in Virginia. Some of them are even growing down into the southeast. They do grow well here in Northern Virginia. The first is highbush blueberry, Vaccinium corymbosum. This, of course, is attractive for its fruit, and these lovely flowers will attract a specialist bee. This is number 5 among the top woody plants, the keystone plants studied by Doug Tellamy. It supports a large number of species of Lepidoptera, 288. Steeplebush, Spirea tomentosa, doesn't have much in the way of nectar, but it still attracts pollinators that are going to make use of its pollen, and it also serves as a larval host. Coastal dog hobble, Leucothoe axillaris, is notable because this is a shorter evergreen shrub. It has a very attractive fountaining habit and these lovely early blooming urn-shaped white flowers. They provide nectar and pollen for bees and butterflies. And that foliage in the winter time takes on kind of a coppery color, very attractive. Pussy willow, Salix discolor, provides early nectar and pollen and is especially helpful for our specialist bees. Doug Tellamy rates the Salix genus as a whole as number 3 among the top 20 woody keystone plants. They will support 455 species of Lepidoptera. Now, an alert about the willows. With their particular rooting system, they're not going to do well planted close to our homes. But if you should happen to have a large property, they could be planted to help control erosion on the border of a pond or a stream. 3 species that grow principally in the Southeast, but they can also be grown here. Sweet shrub, Calycanthus floridus. This has interesting strap-like petals and is one of those plants that is primarily pollinated by beetles. The Athens cultivar, which has kind of a lime green color, is still blooming in my garden now. Dwarf Fothergilla, Fothergilla gardinii, is the shorter of the Fothergilla species. It has these charming bottle brush-shaped flowers that appear earlier in the spring that provide pollen and nectar to bees and others. And it's notable for its very attractive multicolored fall foliage. Oakleaf hydrangea, Hydrangea quercifolia, provides nectar and pollen to bees, wasps, and syrphid flies. They will dive deep into the flower clusters to look for the underlying fertile flowers, and then the sterile flowers will change from white to pink over the season. To finish up, I'd like to share with you a couple of my favorite resources. I mentioned earlier that I had given talks on the keystone plants and on the woody vines, and I refer you to those in our Master Gardener virtual classroom. Should you want to know more about pollinator plants of the herbaceous type, or want to hear the very specific gardening practices, especially providing support for our stem nesting and ground nesting bees, I refer you to 2 earlier talks I gave, Partnering with Pollinators and Small Space Gardening for Pollinators, also available in that virtual classroom. And finally, for those who really would like to attract butterflies, my colleague, Alyssa Ford Morell, has given a wonderful talk called The Hospitable Gardener, Welcoming Beautiful Butterflies and Moths. Another Master Gardener colleague, Mary Free, has created 3 wonderful resources on our MGNV website. The first is this list of best bets plants for pollinators. Every year around this time, she creates blog posts on pollinators, and this last year included a very detailed list of nectar and host plants for selected mid-Atlantic butterflies and moths. And finally, she created this wonderful prize-winning publication, Creating Inviting Habitats. It talks about habitats for birds and hummingbirds among them, but also discusses habitats for butterflies. If you have a chance to hear any presentations by Heather Holm, I highly encourage you to attend those. She is really becoming a very authoritative expert on native bees and wasps. These are 3 books that you will enjoy with fantastic detailed explanations of the life cycles of all of the different categories of bees and wasps, illustrated with very detailed photographs. And online, you can refer to charts on plants. This Forest Service publication just gives some nice, very brief bee basics. And then there are several websites on native bees put together by Jared Fowler and Sam Droege. You'll see fantastic close-up photographs of all the species of native bees. And if you would like to provide special support for them, there are detailed lists of the plants for those specialist bees. And finally, for those who want to find sources for native plants locally, I recommend the Plant Nova Natives website. This is for those folks who are in Northern Virginia or a little further afield. For other folks attending today from Virginia, I refer you to the Virginia Native Plant Society to learn not only about plant sales, but about native plant nurseries throughout the state. Similarly, there are resources provided by the Maryland Native Plant Society. And for those attending from any other state, I refer you either to your local extension agent or, again, to the resources of your state plant society. Do we have any final questions to wrap up for today, Ben?
We have several questions. If you could maybe share just a little bit more about using multiple species of arrowwood to improve cross-pollination, and specifically wondering if you have specific recommendations about species.
I personally use the straight species of arrowwood. There are several different alternatives that you have when you want to encourage that cross-pollination. I was lucky to get my plants from a native plant nursery that does not reproduce them clonally. It doesn't take cuttings. So therefore, each plant having genetic variation, having already been reproduced through cross-pollination, each plant will have a slightly different genetic profile. So my 3 plants cross-pollinate and produce abundant fruit. Another option would be to just source your plants from several different native plant nurseries. So the plants will vary in genetic composition. A third option would be to have a straight species plant and maybe to opt for one of the cultivars. I personally don't use the cultivars of arrowwood, but there are a number of them available. One thing that I didn't mention is that I will be carefully going through all of the discussion in the chat box. And if there are any questions that I haven't answered fully, I will be preparing an addendum document. This will be available along with the fully captioned recording and the PDF of the slides that I've mentioned. These will all be available on the website within a couple of weeks.
Christine had a question in the chat. She wants to know if the black haw viburnum is often attacked by viburnum beetles.
I will need to look into that. I haven't had any particular problems really with any pests or diseases to speak of with my native shrubs, with the exception of some of the woolies, the cottony scale on my winterberry. And those I spotted early and I was able to hand pick. But I will do a little looking into that and provide the answers to that for you in the addendum.
Another question in the chat, is the toxicity of elderberry a reason not to plant it in the home garden?
Again, I would refer you to that North Carolina site that I mentioned. I'm hoping that that contact information has been provided in the chat. I'll be sure to provide that in my addendum document, because that particular site has investigated the question of toxicity for all of the native plants and makes a point of describing that on their fact sheets.
Another participant today noted that they had planted 6 inkberries. They bought 4 that were flowering and 2 that were not. They've been planted in the ground for about 3 years, but they only see flowers on one of the plants, and is just curious if you have any advice for them on why the others may not be flowering.
I would think after several years, we quite often use the expression that plants will creep and then and eventually after about the 3rd year, they'll take that leap. So it may take a little bit of time for them to establish their root systems. If you've sited them properly, so if they're getting the proper exposure to sun, and those plants do well in a range of sun exposures, and if they have enough moisture, I would think that they should be flowering. But again, I can look into that.
Another participant today would like to know if there's an easy way to identify the native elderberry from the European elderberry.
Let me look into that as well, because I know some of these plants will look fairly similar. One of my other talks on caring for your native plant garden, I show close-ups of the differences between the male and female flowers for the dioecious species. So that could help you single out which ones are which when you're trying to source your plants.
Sounds good. I think there's one last outstanding question in the chat. Jamie would like to know if New Jersey tea is safe to be planted anywhere near to a well or a septic tank because of its root system.
That might be questionable. This plant really is going to do best in drier conditions, and its root system is pretty extensive. I'll do a little more research to be sure of the accuracy of my response, but I would think that that might be one plant to steer clear of.
Elaine, no more questions are showing in the chat right now, so the last word is with you.
Thank you so much for attending today. I hope that today's presentation has given you a few more ideas of how you could expand your plant palette and also make it more interesting architecturally and ecologically by adding these different woody plant layers. One final point is you might want to look in your particular jurisdictions for any tree canopy programs. Many local jurisdictions now are really trying to encourage those of us homeowners to add these plants. They will increase the canopy layer and be beneficial not just for us as far as screening, cooling the environment, and all of those other ecosystem functions I mentioned, but providing the benefits for our pollinators as well. So I wish you, until we see each other again, very happy gardening.
Thank you, Elaine. This was a tremendous presentation. As always, folks in the chat are really lighting up, loving all of the great content and resources that you've provided. So I just want to say thank you again to everybody for making it out today. Hope that everybody has a really great, fabulous weekend, that everyone is staying safe with that smoky air out there, okay? Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks again to you, Elaine.
Thank you.